Welcome to this edition of Inside the Cubs on miCubs.com. I'm Brian Bedo. I had the chance to talk with Jim Callis of Baseball America about the Cubs' 2011 draft class, as well as how the players on his 2011 Cubs prospect list are faring so far this season. Here's my conversation with Jim Callis of Baseball America. Jim, thanks so much for joining me today. Let's start with the draft that happened just about a month ago or so. We'll start with the first-round pick, Javier Baez. The Cubs take him 9 overall. What can you tell us about Javier Baez?
Well, I think that the thing that jumps out about Javier the most is that he had the best bat speed in the draft. He's a Florida kid with tremendous bat speed. You can't avoid but drawing some Gary Sheffield comparisons. I think there's some question as to whether he stays at shortstop. Some teams thought he had a chance to. Other teams thought if he can't stay at short, then he'd make a very good third baseman. Obviously, at short with Starlin Castro, it's not like that's a cry name for the Cubs anyway. I think first and foremost they took him for the bat, but it's just a very, very exciting high school bat. And, unfortunately, with the way most of these signings go, with the signing deadline, the way MLB implements the signing process, he probably won't sign until August 15th, and we won't get to see him play much this year. But it's a potentially special bat that could move very, very quickly.
What about some of the other guys the Cubs took in the early rounds? I heard an interview with you talking about Tony Zych, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, a Louisville guy, an Illinois native that you really liked. What can you tell us about him and maybe some of the other guys in the early rounds?
Yeah, I did really like Tony, and I do. He's a guy who I thought was going to be a sandwich pick. I think what worked against him a little bit is there's so many interesting college relievers available this year that maybe he didn't stand out as much as he normally would have. But he was a guy, we thought was going to go in the sandwich round area. A guy who consistently works, in the mid-90s with his fastball, and he's got probably an average slider. I think the ceiling's a closer. He might do more of a set man. I think it all comes down to how well that slider develops. But he's going to be a guy who I think is going to be in the big leagues very, very quickly. So I thought he was a steal in the fourth round. Their second rounder's an interesting guy, Dan Vogelbach. Big. Mm-hmm. I do mean big. He's 6 foot and listed at 240, and he's been, 270-ish in the past. But he's a high school, Florida kid, big-time power, hit a 508-foot shot at this thing they call the International Power Showcase, which is like a high school home run derby. So he's got really, really intriguing power. And then I think two of the names that kind of jumped out at everybody were just for their name value were Trevor Gretzky and Sean Dunston Jr. in the 7th and 11th round. And I'll be honest, we weren't, I don't think, as high on Gretzky as the Cubs were. I thought he was a guy who would, the reports we had is, not really ready for pro ball, and you figure the family's got some money, he's Wayne's son, and his mom made some good money as a Hollywood actress. And I thought he'd wind up at San Diego State, but when you see him in the 7th round, maybe that won't happen. And Sean Dunston Jr., he's kind of a toolsy guy. He didn't have a great year as a high school senior, and we'll see on him. I don't think either of those guys is just going to be a slot signing guy. Dunston's going to Vanderbilt, and again, if I'm Sean Dunston's dad, I guess if I was Sean Dunston's dad, I'd have a much better arm than I do. But
that was my favorite player growing up as a kid, Sean Dunston. My favorite all time. I was thrilled when they draft Junior.
If it's my kid and he might not be ready for pro ball and he can go to Vanderbilt, that's an easy decision. I'm sending him to Vanderbilt, but we'll have to see on those two guys if they wind up signing him.
Let's look at your top 10 prospects heading into the year for the Cubs. Obviously, it's much different because that list, I believe, came out about 2 or 3 days before the Matt Garza trade, which had 3 of those guys in that trade, talking about Chris Archer, Hak-Ju Lee, and Brandon Geyer. So it looks a little bit different now, but you look at some of the top guys on that list, Brett Jackson, who was very good before he got hurt, still trying to regain that early season form. Trey McNutt, who's been battling blister issues, has struggled at times. Who else on the list? Hayden Simpson was just sent down to Mesa because he's lost a ton of velocity trying to come back from mono. Do you value some of these guys on this list a little bit lower than you did at the start of the season and when you made this list?
Yes and no, I guess, Brian. I think you have to ding them a little bit just because of what's happened this year. But I still think when you're looking at prospects, you have to look at the full body of work. And I guess if I'm looking at this, if I'm trying to be optimistic about these guys, that there are physical reasons these guys haven't performed as hoped. Jackson got off to a tremendous start. and then he got hurt, and he hasn't been the same guy since. I mean, I don't think it's anything long-term. You know, the tools are still there. But you know, again, if you're looking at the numbers, you wish he was hitting better than 260 in Double-A. You know, you expected more out of him than that. I think the positive for him, he's drawn a lot of walks this year. You know, more walks than he has in the past. So I don't think him too much. I think with pitchers, again, you want, you know, because I think the injuries jump out a little bit more at you. You know, McNutt, you know, it is a blister. You know, but that said, you know, it's only 44 innings. I mean, he's been getting hit around. He's not missing any bats. I mean, the stuff hasn't been as devastating this year. So, I mean, when I ding him, I mean, I'm dinging him from the standpoint of I had him as a top 50 overall prospect in the game coming into the year, and right now I wouldn't put him in the top 50. But, you know, the hope there is, you know, you get him past the blister problem and he'll be fine. With Simpson, I mean, you know, the wild card there was he had this severe case of mono and lost a lot of weight, and I just don't think he's gotten his strength back. Really got knocked around in Peoria, although on him, you know, he was always a tough one for me because I do most of the Midwest for our draft coverage.
Right.
I actually don't do Arkansas anymore, but I did do Arkansas last year, and I liked Hayden Simpson, but we saw Hayden Simpson as a 4th or 5th round pick. We did not see the same stuff. You know, from when we were talking to people, they didn't see the same stuff that the Cubs apparently saw. You know, when they saw him in the playoffs, in the Division II playoffs down in Florida last May, and so I think the way the Cubs have perceived Hayden Simpson is not necessarily the way a lot of teams perceived Hayden Simpson or the way that we perceived Hayden Simpson. So I think he's definitely better than he showed at Peoria, but I never, I'll put it this way, I have yet to be convinced that he should have been a first-round pick. I'm not knocking the Cubs, because everybody likes who they like, and you can't trade up or down, and I know they were concerned the Angels were on him. The Angels had 5 picks before they picked again. But I guess what would be disappointing is even if you write off some of this to the mono and losing strength, you still would have hoped for more out of a guy who was a first-round pick going to low A ball.
Well, one guy you really nailed on this list that you liked a year ago when we talked to you, you liked his story, you were hoping he would choose baseball over football, and that is Matt Caesar, who's having a heck of a season down in the Midwest League in Peoria, heading to the MLB Futures game. He's been towards the top of the Midwest League leaderboard in hitting, stolen bases. He's been great. Defensively, he's been good as well. What have you seen from Caesar so far this year, and do you think your 7th ranking on this list, do you think he warrants that, or maybe he's a little bit better than what you had expected?
I think if you're doing the list today, if I was doing the list today, you know, and again, I mean, it's hard with the way McNutt's pitched just because of blisters, but you can maybe give Brett Jackson, you might still put Brett Jackson number 1 because he's done in Double-A. But you can make a case. You can make a case that Matt Caesar's their number 1 prospect, and I think if I was doing the list today, I can't imagine I would actually have Matt Caesar lower than number 2. And I guess the reason I got excited about him when we were talking about him last year, you see a lot of really tremendous athletes. You know, baseball hasn't shared tremendous athletes and these multi-sport guys, and so I mean they're exciting. You know, we were talking about Caesar's, you know, speed. You know, obviously the tool jumps off the board the most, but I think what set him apart. And we saw a little bit of it last year, and again, it was a small sample size, but there's a reason I started to get excited about him, just from talking to people about him and from the way he performed, is he's not just an athlete. He can really hit. And a lot of times these guys, even though he did play baseball full-time in college, he was a 2-sport guy, so he wasn't doing fall ball. You know, he was torn between 2 sports. And a lot of times those guys lose at bats, or they just don't develop as hitters, because I really think, even more so than pitching, I think with hitting, you have to have those constant at-bats and constantly work on it as an amateur, and that if you get away from it, even for a year or two, like a Drew Henson, for example, it's hard to get that back. And, you know, Caesar came out and hit 349 in his brief pro debut last year, and he's come out. You know, they sent him to Peoria, which is not an easy place to hit between the weather and the parks, and it's a tough environment. I mean, he's hitting 311 as we speak right now, and he's hitting 311, and he's shown some gap power, and the speed's playing on the bases and in center field. And I know the Cubs, when they've talked about him, have said, you know, the more this guy plays, it just seems like the better he gets. He shows more power. He gets better defensively. He actually worked on his arm strength. You know, an arm's something that a lot of these football guys don't have, because if you're not throwing repeatedly, you lose arm strength. A lot of them have well below average arms, and his arm is probably, you know, a solid average arm now, or at least close to it. And it's just exciting, because I think the more that this guy puts into baseball and plays full time, he's made so much progress already. And it's not like an athlete and you're hoping he might hit. This guy's going to hit. I think the question is, how much power is he going to have? But he's controlled the strike zone very, very well. Maybe could draw a few more walks, but I just think he's one of these guys who puts the bat on the ball so easy and squares it up. Kind of like in a way, it kind of reminds me of Starlin Castro, to be honest.
Jim, one more thing before I let you go. The Cubs just signed a Dominican shortstop named Enrique Acosta for $1.1 million, and to give fans a perspective, that's sometimes more than the Cubs have paid for a first-round pick. But can you tell us anything about this guy, or is he as unknown to you as he is to us?
Well, I can crib a little bit. Ben Badler does most of our international stuff, so I know what Ben Badler's reported, so I might know a little bit more. Although, again, this is Ben's work. I don't purport to know much about these guys firsthand, but no, he's an interesting guy. I mean, I think the thought is that he's going to have to move to maybe third base or maybe be a corner outfielder. At least from the people Ben talked to before he signed. But he's a bat, good bat speed, clean swing, uses the whole field, short stroke, advanced for a 16-year-old bat. It's much more advanced than your typical 16-year-old Dominican bat. The ball seems to jump off his bat. He's got some power potential. He just doesn't have the defensive tools are not there for shortstop. But at third base or corner outfielder, more pressure on the bat, but it looks like the bat can handle it. So it's interesting. The bonuses are always tough to compare because these guys obviously are free agents, and you're going to go to the team that's willing to spend you the most. So it's hard to compare them necessarily to a draft bonus, but you're right. I mean, that is more than they sometimes spend their first-round pick. And in fact, I'm trying to think off the top of my head what Hayden Simpson last year, because he kind of cut a deal. He signed for less than he got $1.06 million. So I think
Tyler Colvin get less than that too? I think he probably did too, or Brett Jackson probably somewhere close in the area.
Yeah, and Brett Jackson was a lower. Brett Jackson got $972, which was slot because he was the 31st overall pick. So it's not saying it's not saying these guys are first-round picks because I think based on where we've seen a couple of the draft free agents, my sense is most of your top draft players, if they were free agents, would get 4 or 5 times what they get as a bonus when they're only out. Yeah, I go back to 1996 on that and. The first pick in the draft was Chris Benson, who at that point was the latest, greatest college pitching prospect ever. Maybe could go straight to the big leagues, which he didn't, but was the clear number 1 prospect, and he got $2 million. And the number 2 draft pick was Travis Lee, who became a free agent, and he got 10. And then there was Matt White, who never played in the big leagues, who became a free agent, and he got 10. And then John Patterson got 6, and Bobby C got 3. So anyway, I mean, I always kind of think of a 4 or 5 times multiplier. I have no doubt in my mind, even a guy like Steven Strasburg, even though he got $15 million, I bet if Steven Strasburg was a free agent, I bet you could have seen Steven Strasburg might have gotten $50 or $60 million, and teams would have gone crazy for him.
Well, Jim, thanks so much for the time. You can catch Jim Callis' stuff and content on BaseballAmerica.com. You can also follow him on Twitter at Jim Callis, BA, all one word. I love talking to you every time we have you on, and I'm hoping we can talk to you again sometime soon.
Yeah, anytime, Brian. No problem at all.
Thanks for listening to this edition of Inside the Cubs. Be sure to check out miCubs.com each and every day for all your Cubs needs.